Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the live discussions, part of the webinars on rewiring democracy, connecting institutions and citizens in the digital age, organized by Symbiosis, School of Political Studies in Greece, affiliated to the Council of Europe network of schools, and based on the presentations of scholars and experts, which are stored online, who are here with us today to further elaborate their views and to discuss. We chose this topic as the rise of the internet challenges the traditional functioning of representative democracy. When we embarked on this, it was striking how our realities are currently shaped and influenced by COVID-19 pandemic. Citizens depended on digital technology to organize and engage in their social, professional, and private lives. Both governments and civil society organizations have relied on digital technologies to provide up-to-date and accurate safety information. Meetings, conferences, and courses have been conducted online, impacting upon the interplay between digital participation and real-life participation. So we wanted to discuss how has the digital impacted upon our lives, our reading, our culture, education, voting, being informed, thinking, and acting. Particularly in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, revisiting through the lens of commoning the digital democratic citizenship and participatory democracy became very interesting to us. Is technology sufficient or not sufficient enough to enable real impact of citizens' voices, even in the digital age? Can all citizens or can all persons be heard? Can digital organizing introduce safeguards and standards for e-democracy applications, encourage NGOs and other democracy agents to make use of these tools for a greater efficiency, accountability, and transparency? All of these questions are open. The pandemic has forced our societies to ask questions about the future of learning, of work, and of civic participation. It has worsened pre-existing inequalities and injustices and has highlighted the potential fragilities and unsustainable aspects of our way of life. Looking at the digital often focuses on debates and priorities in the Western part of Europe. How then to ensure more understanding of multiple realities through the political debate and therefore promote more knowledge and mutual understanding globally? So we have invited several people who work on democracy to share with us their understanding and to be with us today. I'll sort of present them randomly. Adria, and I hope I pronounced the names correctly. Adria Rodriguez Perez, public policy researcher from Skittle, Barcelona. Carl Miller, who is the research director at the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos in London. Eleni Lenyomi-Rivili, who has a very long title, Senior Advisor to the City of Athens, Chief Resilience Officer and former Deputy Mayor, also Atlantic Council Senior Fellow and Consultant, AARF, I don't know what this is, Resilience Center, and Associate Professor at the University of the Aegean, who is now in Athens. And Ned Howie is the CEO and co-founder Tectonica Digital Campaign Solutions in Barcelona. So Barcelona by far over.
Represent.
So I have to sort of remind us all and myself that our discussion is taking place in a country where only a few days ago, the government announced that from 2021, the fax, that facsimile machine, will not be used in public services. I don't know if some of you even don't know what fax is because you were not born when faxes were used. But in our public services in Greece, we still have that machine, sort of copying and transporting documents into public servants' offices and not emails. So public services have not been digitized yet. which is very telling about our reality. I have to remind participants that they can send questions from the chat, and we should start this discussion with I can go around asking some introductory questions to you and then open it up. We start with Lenyo, and you presented the interplay of the challenges of our societies globally, climate change, inequalities, gaps in policy making, and also the importance of leadership, sort of bringing out the outstanding issues of representative democracy and multilateralism, which is another issue I wanted to bring in the discussion because we hear it so much lately. Do you feel that this order of things, the world as we know it, is rapidly being threatened by the forceful entry of the digital? At the city level, how do you think governance has been affected by digital changes, as you have the experience of the city of Athens? So these are just two questions that I'm sort of throwing at you.
I mean, as everybody keeps saying, when we are under a situation of crisis and in a situation of shock, it presents an opportunity to really establish change, important kind of transformations. And one of them is, as you referred to before, there's been the kind of move towards a smarter and more kind of digitalized city as far as its services are concerned. So it's things that we should have done for years now suddenly happened very fast in a couple of months when COVID arrived in our lives. So it's kind of great. We started really being able to do things much easier and much faster, and all different types of services that the city actually provides for the citizens are now done over online from your home, and you just get a digital copy and you just put your digital signature, and things are really fun and really faster, much faster than before. Standing in lines and dealing with the bureaucrats that you never knew what kind of mood they were going to be on. So, but of course, there is the other side of things, which is that we all have started considering the darker side of how digitality has entered our lives in a very pervasive way, and how social media have become an aspect that actually can break up social cohesion rather than pull social cohesion together, and actually kind of work for the interests of not the people, but the interests of people that make money or people that have power, and people lose power through their use. So we've been also recently bombarded with information of how these things really work, and started to understand this thing that in this very famous book was called Surveillance Capitalism. So I'll leave it here because it's a big discussion. So of course it's both great and dangerous, as most things are.
Thank you, Lenyo. So we can move to Carl Miller, who actually wrote the book on digital power, and in a way challenged the status quo of democratic systems as they stand, as well as their understanding until now. No, Carl doesn't do that. Digital power does this. So Carl, do you think that the digital can by transforming political power, actually win or win back what representative democracy has lost, which is the trust of people? And then, because what we have witnessed is the erosion of trust to political systems, to politicians, which has become a very painful process. at least in our countries in Europe, for a long, long time, and of course, other places as well. So, is it possible that through the transformations that digital power can bring, people can start not fearing, as Legnaud described, not being apprehensive, not being mistrustful, but actually believing and participating and feeling an affect for politics again?
Well, thanks very much for that question, and hi there, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I think that kind of crisis of representative democracy is the right place to start. We often think it's one particular event, whether that's the election of Donald Trump or an interference in the election, which is really driving this. But really, we've been locked on a long 50-year decline in representative democratic participation. So across Europe, membership of political parties has been declining over that time scale. Trust of politicians has been declining over that time scale. The general answers people give when you ask them, do you think your parliament is listening to you? Do you think that politics has your best interests in heart? They've all been declining over those kind of timescales as well. And that's kind of across Europe, I think. Like, that was the heady brew that this kind of digital maelstrom of digital mobilizations found. So right when representative democracy, for lots of reasons that really didn't have much to do with technology at all, was already creaking, there you had suddenly all these quick and easy ways of creating new groups, new mobilizations, new political identities, new grievances, kind of there at everyone's fingertips. And I suppose the last 10 years or so have been an extremely kind of rocky history of those two things mixing together. The optimism is really in how digital technology can kind of allow us to move beyond that, I think. And I think what's most exciting is not just the way in which digital technology allows us to oppose power. That is really important. But also how it allows us to basically also begin to reconstitute what a democracy even really looks like. And there, I think its challenge is really very quiet. We don't often talk about that kind of thing. Everyone's really obsessed by what Donald Trump is tweeting about or the next election. But underneath that is really the profound challenge, which I think is beginning to emerge to the democratic system. And in the talk, that the example that I foreground again and again and again when I try and give examples of this is what happened in Taiwan. It was just like across Europe, there was a democratic crisis, a crisis of trust, a crisis of legitimacy, a protest, partly mobilized online, an occupation, indeed, of a parliament because people felt so distant from it. And then they basically used digital technology to remake how that decision-making was going to work, called V-Taiwan. And that is now, I think, a shining example to lots of people, lots of digital democrats across the West. I can talk more, of course, about how that actually works whenever you like. But to say it's really possible that power can really be connected up with entirely different ways of making decisions, which are partly digital, partly not. And I think when that realization happens, the lid comes off, because suddenly the kind of forms that our democracy can take become limitless. I mean, we can create and invent entirely new ways of putting the people in charge. I think that's a kind of moment really of kind of great excitement and probably great fear at exactly the same time, because I think, right at now, when there is actually less and less really tying people to the democratic systems that we have, I don't think it really takes very much for quite large systems to begin to experiment with new ways. And that of course brings that age-old kind of dualism of opportunities and challenges in equal measure.
True, and it brings also another sort of old question. Will the existing systems go out that easily? Will they be transformed? What will happen to political parties? What will happen to nation states? What to multilateralism as we know it, which is pretty much intergovernmental institutions? And you also speak about something that Ned and Adria also spoke about, and Lenyo in her own way, the need to build consensus. And you sort of elaborate on how the transformations of digital power build consensus. How can this sort of play into all these amazing contentions that all these changes are bringing and the inevitable reactions to it?
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that to me, what was so kind of exciting about the Taiwan example, I went there, God, it feels like an age ago now, when we could still get on planes with the BBC to do a documentary about VTaiwan. It was a small engineering tweak which began it all. So they simply flipped around what kind of messages people would see. So they gathered everyone, like we often do, into a single online environment in order to discuss a particular issue. The first one they did this with was Uber regulation. Very polarized, very angry. Typically 2 poles apart. You have the people that love Uber, the people that hate Uber, and they've never been able to find consensus around that. And completely unlike Twitter or Facebook or any of the other platforms that will typically surface content which is divisive because it's also very gripping, and that's the interests that platforms have, is to grip your attention. What they did is they turned that platform engineering on its head and instead said, we're going to surface the comments around Uber that are most consensual. There are lots of clever ways of finding this, lots of ways of mapping out the debate, lots of ways of kind of gamifying, essentially, the finding of consensus. And when they made that small tweak, the tenor of the debate completely changed. So that small tweak actually revealed, I thought, a kind of fundamental human truth, which is that on many issues of fiery contention, you've got maybe 5 or 6 key points that human beings bitterly disagree about. But you've actually underneath that got dozens and dozens and dozens of points which actually we have a lot in common with. Like across the so-called political divides, actually there's loads of things which we have in common with each other, which you just simply never actually see or hear about. And when you flipped the kind of like discussion on its head so that those ones became most visible and the divisive ones became basically invisible, and people wanting to be visible basically were incentivized to draft as consensual statements as possible, it's like, you know, this iceberg suddenly kind of floated up out of the ocean and became really visible. And when you made dozens and dozens of different points around Uber, which people agreed with, suddenly more visible, you can create law around it. You can make political decision making around it. And that's what they did. And then they did it again and again and again and again for law after law. Dozens now of laws and regulations have been basically constructed on exactly that same process. And I think, you know, that is so, if there's one point that perhaps people can take from what I'm saying here today, let it be this: like the online terrains and environments that we inhabit, you know, are administered and designed in ways which we can't actually explicitly see, but which make an enormous difference to who we really are and the debates that we have. Platform engineering is probably one of the most important topics that we need to now think about when it comes to understanding power and understanding politics. You tweak the platforms and how they work. You tweak how politics really comes out.
Okay, we'll discuss this further, I think. Now, let's move to Ned, who actually also spoke about consensus building and about digital organizing and digital mobilizing. And Tectonica has done this very interesting research to which Symbiosis also participated, being mostly lost, but learning a lot about it, and primarily learning about the need to learn more. So your research was about this massive the research showed the massive unrealized potential for digital organizing and mobilizing in Europe. And you developed a few points like more communication sharing and relationship building, development of the evidence base for digital organizing into shareable best practices, investment in coaching, training, and expert support, deploying communications, willingness to shift culture and decentralize power. This decentralized power really got my attention. And all of this speaks to what Carl has been saying. So I was I want you to sort of expand more of that, because usually when people think about digital organizing, at least in Greece, they can go to the extent of thinking about advocacy work, not about, so what Carl actually spoke about as the retired music teacher that through support from a small German town, that through support in digital technology manages to advocate and win a case on trade dispute in Germany. That is what we can all envisage, what we can imagine and think about. But there seems to be so many more possibilities: legislation making, deliberation, even actually changing, exactly transforming political power. So would you like to tell us more?
Yeah, and it's actually great because what you have been talking about so far basically is very much the context and the reality with which we live. I mean, it is true, the last 50 years have seen continual decline in kind of democratic institutions and faith in democracy. But really, I think in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, we've seen this go into hyperdrive. And I think that's mostly because of the kind of changing way that we process information through social media. We really do start from a starting place of distrust of anything that's authoritarian, that anything that smells even slightly close to authority starts, in general, populations start with a distrust mode. And that really includes politicians and political parties and media, all these different places. We're in a very different place than we were 15 years ago. And that's partly because we have relationships, because of the nature of social media, where the information that we're getting feels a lot closer to us. It's coming from our friends, or it's coming, even if you look at, the online relationships and the complexity of online relationships you have with most of the businesses you're interacting with these days, and compare that to your relationship of civic engagement, it's pretty interesting, right? The place you buy shoes from, or the thing that helped you get from one place to the other, or the, all these relationships you have online feel very personalized and highly close. Whereas probably the relationship you have with your political party or the activist cause you believe in most likely doesn't feel that close online. It doesn't feel as customized to you, as personalized. And so we've kind of created this, we haven't really met the expectation gap that's changed in people's minds in terms of those relationships and that closeness. Our work and what we do with folks at Tectonica, we've worked with about 400 clients now, and going on almost 500, 36 countries in the world. And our work is not to bring people to politicians or to political parties. We say we could win every single campaign that we have out there, and we've won quite a few, which is fun, always good. That's what people pay us for. But that's not really our mission. Our mission is really to change the way which people do politics, so that we're working with those political parties or those campaigns to use digital organizing to transform the way that they're going to people, so that people see themselves in the movement, have a place, have a much more highly complex relationship with the entities that are political. And that's how we believe that trust is established. In the report itself, we went out, we've known this from seeing this in our work kind of instinctually, and I talk to people, sometimes they invite you miss a lot of my parlor tricks when it's on Zoom, but usually if we were in a conference that, we're the 4 of us on stage or 5 of us on stage or whatever, or be behind a podium. And I usually most easily demonstrate the kind of shift that we're looking at kind of political entities by literally jumping off of the stage and into the crowd. And you feel the shift when I'm in the middle of a crowd. Everyone in that crowd feels the difference in dynamic, in the way that I'm viewed, in the way that you hear me, in the energy kind of that surrounds the interaction. That's the kind of shift and dynamic that needs to happen with political parties for them to actually develop that trust. Now, how we do that is a much more complicated question, and very much what our report was about was, how are people doing digital? Are people doing it right? Or, how can we categorize these different things? And yeah, we did kind of create this framework where we looked at the different areas of digital organizing based upon decentralization and based upon personalization. And of course, we saw that pretty much of the 150, kind of quantitative participants, everyone kind of had, the general idea was that there needs to be this mix of activities from one-way communication to decentralized, to fully decentralized organizing. But yeah, when we saw what people actually were doing in their campaigns, and we did only, survey progressives because that's our interest and that's our worst. So folks that are centering to the left, right, is a very different story. But we saw that people really weren't doing what they know they need to be doing to be developing that trust, having those relationships that when they're online are deeper relationships. So even I'd say a lot of in places where in kind of civic engagement, we've moved online, we're not necessarily doing it in the right ways just because we've moved online. And so what's really important is there seems to be this cycle that I observe out there where people say, well, Facebook is crazy and it doesn't need to do the, like get mad at like all these kind of digital ads are, what a waste of time. So all of digital is a waste of time. But what we need to understand that all of digital interactions that can happen are not one-way communication, are not digital ads, are not, there's multiple ways that we need to do this. And we need to keep pushing the envelope and develop further so that we can bring those relationships in the sense of civic engagement, that we can bring them closer and more personalized, and to decentralize the power so that ultimately campaigns, political parties, political entities, politicians are actually held accountable in their actions. They will be elected, they will continue to gain whatever, if they're actually accountable in a decentralized way, if they're actually giving people a seat at the table, listening to them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and organizations and civic organizations, but also movements, become themselves more decentralized, allowing a polyphony to exist and different ways of organizing. And you can elaborate better than I can.
And yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And one of the things is that we have this real potential to be doing this in the right way, but there are significant barriers. Of those barriers that are clearly out there is that people don't necessarily know how to do this. Like we're seeing a lot of people being thrown into digital organizing in the political sense with almost no training. We see folks that their major source of learning is by learning other campaigns, but then also the most answered, what campaigns are inspiring you, people don't know or none is the largest answer to that. So we're really seeing a situation where we have a technological thing that we need to advance to be able to make decentralized organizing more powerful. And that's not to say we don't need narrative and we don't need one-way communication and we don't need storytelling and we don't need list building and all those other things, because we actually do, even if we're going to do decentralized organizing. But if we're only doing that stuff and we're not doing the deeper level things that are more personalized out of our relationships online, then people are going to continue to distrust, not see themselves in movements, continue to disengage. I think the best story that I had a few years ago was after the Reed Awards, which is like the US political industry's big awards, industry awards. I went out with it was in Las Vegas. So we went out to the blackjack tables and I'm sitting there, with a Republican friend of mine who's Republican operator. I'm, on the left and operating from there, and a libertarian. And we asked the, blackjack table, because we're political people, who did you vote for? And of course she voted for Trump. And we asked her, why? Why did you vote for Trump? She said, I just didn't want a politician. That's the situation that we're in. And I think that until we start to recognize that people have lost that faith and try to use digital methods differently, we're going to continue to be in that situation.
Thanks. So let's move to Adria. And I must say his presentation touched my heart, and brought me back 20 years when I was an election observer with OSCE ODIHR, a multilateral organization maybe on its way out. Actually, democratization, human rights in the Balkans in the beginning of the years 2000. And we had to cross icy fields, climb mountains, starve, freeze to death, to reach the election places, to actually count ballots with bullets being fired outside, closed in the room. So your presentation about e-voting was really different and brought an insight of how things have changed and what we are discussing today. So, but I assume that the main question in the participants' minds concerns the safety of the votes, as well as whether this type of elections, of expression of the majority will or the people's will, can actually beat corruption. So what brings us to whether the holding of the elections can actually influence the system that goes before it, the election process. So if you would like Adria to speak on that, then we can sort of.
Yeah, sure. Well, there are many issues interesting here to discuss about. First, I want to thank you for the opportunity to giving me this space to debate them with you and with the rest of speakers. Regarding internet voting, which is the topic of my presentation, although I think we can think about the participation more broadly later on. It's interesting to see first that it wouldn't work in the context that you described. Unfortunately, even nowadays, elections don't always take place in an environment where electoral management bodies are trusted, where people have actually easy access to making a free choice, which not only means casting a vote, but also having the opportunity to actually learn about the different options that are there, making an informed decision, and being able to come up with accountability mechanisms, but that's another story. What we've seen is that in more, let's say, stable democracies, internet voting has been gaining weight, specifically as an additional voting channel, although in some places we can see it as a unique voting channel, mostly because it's seen as a mechanism that not necessarily increases turnout, although it does, but because it makes the electoral process more accessible. No, Carl was speaking before about the health of our democracies, and International IDEA, for instance, in their last bi-yearly report on the state of democracy worldwide, they were reaching a similar conclusion. No, we have nowadays more democracies than ever, but the quality of these democracies is falling sharply, and internet voting has been seen as a way to actually tackle some of these concerns. Obviously, if people feel disenfranchised, if they feel that the institutions don't represent them any longer, internet voting is not going to become a silver bullet. But even when people trust their institutions, they feel themselves as politically effective. If they feel that there are hurdles for them to actually participate in public life in the most important political event in a democracy, which is an election, obviously this is not going to help either. What we've seen is that those countries that have introduced internet voting have countries, or well, my presentation focused on countries, but we can think about other settings, like for instance municipalities that have adopted internet voting for participatory budgeting, or political parties that introduced internet voting at the beginning just for primary elections. They've seen that once you have the infrastructure, it's the cost of voting more often is very low. So actually, when you have the digital infrastructure in place, you can not just put makeup or apply makeup on your electoral processes. You can actually transform the decision-making ecosystem of your organization. No, and for instance, these parties that at the beginning just rented our services to run a primary election, then they use it to choose their leadership, not just their candidates, and even to change their name, or to change whether they will their party members will be in favor or against of forming part of a coalition, which is something that we saw recently in Germany with the Social Democratic Party, and many other questions that actually put the role of citizenship at the core of decision making. No, so these kind of spillover effects of e-voting can clearly take place in this context. And contrary to what it will happen, is they also impact the trust that people have in the institutions that represent them, because contrary to what we've seen in last years, where citizens just choose their representatives private or public, and then they are put aside until the next elections take place. Now they are called more often to have a say. Sometimes because politicians don't want to make the hard choices, and they prefer citizens to do it on their behalf, so they cannot be made responsible for that. But this, at the end of the day, it's also in our benefit, because we can actually have a say. And what we've seen is that municipalities that, for instance, first started having only participatory budgeting processes where the town hall will decide how much money they will spend. Now they use internet voting for almost any kind of decisions, and not just decisions that take place in a moment of time, such as the selection of representatives or projects to be financed, but to run assemblies, to run meetings more often in an asynchronous manner. And also here they tap also on the potential for not just participatory understood as a representative decision, but also deliberation. And here I think it's where we can start discussing with the rest. It's like how now, specifically in the context of the pandemic, where we've seen a surge in deliberative processes, as Carl was talking about Taiwan, no? The OECD for the developed economic countries also speaks of a wave of deliberation that we've seen in the last 10 years. How we can tap on the potential of technology for this wave not to start ebbing because of the restrictions that we're seeing, potential effects on political effectiveness that citizens may feel as a result of the current context, and so on.
And I can see a lot of advantages actually on the financial side of efficiency and effectiveness. Also in other modes of governance or multilateralism, I can see the European Parliament functioning differently. The deliberative processes that inform the Commission, the European Commission decisions. Of course, the municipalities, definitely the universities, but also, for example, something we both know well, Council of Europe, how many committees, how many can function differently, how much this dilemma of the governmentalism or, more citizenship approaches can be solved in these ways. But I will leave it to that. Eleni, Lenyo, would you like to come in with something? Because I can see
I was just thinking after listening to the rest of the speakers, and especially Adria, whether there is something that in these kind of new modes of democracy and participation, specifically the digital kind of participatory systems, whether there is, because you kept talking, Adria, about municipalities and bringing the notion of the city kind of more as a unit that is more functional in a way, and more, we have seen it actually kind of, so what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that there is a lack of trust, even through the digitality of the exchanges, when it has to do with larger units of belonging, like national or party politics or ideological kind of framings of things, and whether there are different levels of engaging that can happen, and whether this would, I mean, Carl, what you were talking about Taiwan was unbelievable. I mean, it's really beautiful to listen to you, present this as a system. However, again, then we go back to this notion of the program. Who is the one that can have power over the writing of the code, and at which level of power? And this is why I'm trying to link in the notion of the city as opposed to the big kind of representational democratic institutions, which the problem is that multilateralism is also not doing very well, which is kind of extremely sad. So we were, at some point, we were hoping that nationalism was kind of falling back, and the political parties were also kind of falling back, but we could work more on the city level and on the multilateral level, but this is not so clear. So I want to hear what you guys are thinking about this kind of power tensions.
Well, that's actually very interesting topic. The first thing is that this change in the democratic patterns is indeed happening at the municipal level. The OECD released recently, I think it was this year, a report on deliberative processes, where they analyzed around 300 deliberative processes that have taken place in the last 40 years. And 51% of them were taking place at the municipal level. So obviously the change is gonna come from there, because, and in contrast, only 15% came at the national level or the state level, depending on the political context. No, the thing is that, notwithstanding, we start to see that governments in states, and when I speak about states, it's the European way, like France, the United Kingdom, even Spain, see the potential of these processes for certain kind of decisions. No, for instance, in the environment area, and I think that this will connect to the topic that you were discussing, governments cannot decide independently from civil society, from citizenship, how to reach environmental goals such as zero net emissions and so on. Now we saw it in France. The government wanted to impose a tax on transportation and the kind of mobilizations that it resulted in meant that the only way to tackle this issue is if you include people, usually people who are randomly selected, so they actually represent all citizens. And we see that this has spread to the United Kingdom, where Extinction Rebellion had a lot of impact. In Spain, it's going to happen. Well, it was supposed to happen, but because of the current context, now things are going a bit slowly. And even the European Union is adopting deliberative methodologies in order to discuss the new Green Deal. So this will have, I mean, obviously change happens easier when the political stakes are, I don't want to say smaller or lower, but where actually there is not so much polarization in terms of a state government wanting to give citizens a voice. But in some cases, and the OECD speaks about these cases where the impact of the decisions is very long term, so it cannot be left to a political party that may not be in power after 4 years in the next election. So it happens too. And I'm very optimistic, and I think we will see states adopting it for many other issues. Actually, if across the Atlantic in the United States, more and more states, and there I mean states like the 50, are using deliberation or permanent assemblies to decide many things, like in Oregon. There it's more used for issues that citizens think that cannot be left to political parties or representatives because they tap on their salaries or the electoral system, in which they will benefit a lot if they decide it. But they are adopting it more commonly, and Oregon, which is one of the pioneer countries, states in using it, has made these kind of bodies now permanent. So there is room. I think that we're learning and we're aware of the benefits of these mechanisms, and that they can be integrated with the current representative institutional frameworks. State governments are more eager to introduce them.
Is it possible? Carol, what about, and Ned, I'm sorry, Ned, you also talked about political, no, but I mean, I want to tie you in because you also talked about, political campaigns, and you talked about the big level, but can we move from the smaller level to kind of the larger level without kind of creating different types of issues? I mean, from the city to...
Do you want to go first, Carl, or should I?
Sure. Well, I'll forego discussing kind of like giving my views on the kind of municipal international layering, because that is a complicated question which I'm not brave enough to answer. But I can offer a kind of a quick thought on this kind of conundrum around what happens when you try and use technology to disperse power. Because technology is a funny thing, and like when quite often it will disperse power in one way, but actually create new concentrations of power in exactly another. And the difficulty can often be that those new forms of power are actually, because they're weird and new, quite camouflaged and therefore less recognized. Within technology, like within the power to actually design these platforms, you know, power of the protocols, power of the platform design, that's exactly what I think often happens. So people have thought about this, of course. And if we go back to Taiwan as well, you know, the people that basically designed that process were civic hackers. They were people that came out of this specific hacker mindset, which they then wanted to play. Hacker is not, in that sense, in no way being an illegal thing, but really just an idea to kind of bend and mold technology. And they wanted to apply it to politics. And that kind of subculture really only built technology in a way which they called open source. This is a kind of long, well-established philosophy to do with tech, which really doesn't ever accept black boxes. It never really accepts commercial control of platforms. It says that everything has to be thrown open, radically transparent, and consensus-based. And in a way, what they were really doing was they were trying to remake politics along the same kind of basic philosophical principles that they had already done by making technology. Now, in one way, that's great, because you then don't have, of course, a single company that's responsible for designing it. So that's a step forwards. The problem is you create new concentrations where a small number of very talented, highly educated technologists usually become the kind of key people that will drive an open source project forwards. If you look at most open source projects, there's a small number of people that do almost all of the code commits, you know, and they're people that are really well respected in their community. They're brilliant at making technology. That's why they do all those code commits. Across the world, really, I've kind of seen that dynamic play out. So not just in politics, but across crime and in warfare and in the economy as well. In each of them, you often have new concentrations of kind of talent who are basically remaking the world through being able to remake the technology that we all use. And when there's a dispute, then you've got warring, basically bands of technologists trying to do this on each side. I mean, privacy is a great example. You know, people making surveillance technology, people making privacy technology, both largely completely outside of the view of the rest of us. So we can't see what's happening, we can't understand, and we can't control it. And it's not really subject to public debate very much. So what ends up winning, say, around surveillance and privacy isn't really what's going to come out of the debates that we have in places like this, or even in the courts. It's simply going to be what technology either makes possible or impossible to do. I mean, Apple's a brilliant example of this. You know, the San Bernardino attacks in the US, this awful terrorist attack. The FBI wanted the data from an attacker's phone. Apple didn't want to give the data over. It was going through the courts. At the same time as it going through the courts, Apple decided to just bake end-to-end encryption in all their devices, so they literally couldn't release the data. That is a very small allegory of a much bigger trend. So in that sense, you know, I'm kind of optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. I mean, I do think it is a step forward when you make these platforms more open, but we do have to be careful about kind of, you know, how those platforms are really developed, and probably in the longer run work really, really hard to connect like broad kind of popular public decision making and opinion formation with what technology is actually being built and what it actually does. There's a huge gap between those two things at the moment.
Yeah, I think to add to that too, probably less eloquently said as Carl just did, but I share a degree. While I'm excited and enthusiastic about kind of new technologies that can develop new ways of decision making in general, I mean, obviously politics at its best is our way of society making big decisions together, big agreements together. But I also see a good degree of kind of like innovation towards direct democracy using digital methods as the kind of towards the goal of trying to like replace representative democracy. And I often see a lot of unintended consequences to that, which can be very harmful. And as you know, the power dynamics and those that are designing, of course, as Carl mentioned, but also the fact that I think it's really important for us to remember that politics is not just election day. Politics is not just up or down vote. Politics is not just vote for one of these candidates. Politics is a process which we engage in our communities at various levels, civic levels, continually, whether that's through support of a political party or no support of a political party, or expressing your opinion online, or any kind of political activism or engagement, which hopefully people are, you know, actually participating in. It's an ongoing process that happens not just election day. And so I feel like one of the things that the kind of like increased election day, just vote on everything kind of dreams that are out there in direct democracy really glosses over also is the reality of the more complicated political processes that are so necessary. One of the things that we heard in our report that was very clear was a lot of these kind of initiatives that are very well intentioned and have some really good aspects. So I'm not going to deny the aspects, but things like the European Citizens Initiative, a lot of those things really gloss over the needs and the voices of marginalized people. If those people have not been broken into the community, and specifically we're talking with an organization that was representing sex workers, you know, you have the most marginalized Europeans out there, basically, mostly migrants, mostly trans women, folks that are, facing multiple things that marginalize them outside of community, and throw on top of that multiple prejudices which they're facing within society. And you can't just take them at the current point around trying to represent solutions for these people's lives to the like, let's everybody vote on it level. So, you know, we need other ways. I see digital for community like that to come forward to raise their voices into the discussion and into a way that is much more complicated, based upon raising voices that are typically marginalized and ensuring that it is really a dialogue, that it's not just a let's everybody express what we currently feel about it, but let's try to come up with solutions that also move ourselves to a consensus point where we are developing best solutions. I know Andrea mentioned kind of I do like this model as not as a replacement for representative democracy, but these models that I do see, and one of our clients has been very involved with this, with the kind of like randomly selected citizens, where you involve people and they have those opportunities to really develop solutions within them. I think that is good because we know that representative politics as well has major issues with power, major issues with people that already have privilege and power, basically being having major advantages both within the actual electoral process and also entering the electoral process with more privilege. And so you see overrepresentation of men, white people, all the things that give people basically privilege in society generally are overrepresented within the representative process. And so that kind of cuts through that a little bit to get some other ideas into the mix. And I believe that if we're really doing digital organizing right in the political way, whether that's with NGOs or campaigns, movements, political parties, unions, whatever that is, if we're doing this, it's going to bring in a degree of that ensures that dialogue is happening with special attention to those voices that have been traditionally marginalized and shut down.
Thank you, Ned.
There's the opportunity for me.
Actually, this was my point as well. I'm actually at the moment trying to persuade some wonderful European artist activists and activists from cultural institutions that it's great that they want to have an initiative. Europe must act on the refugees situation in the Aegean Islands and the absolutely degrading inhuman conditions and all of this. But they have to have the voices of the refugees themselves and allow them to have also their voices heard, participate in the deliberations, in digital activism, and also produce art themselves, if they're artists, which is something that sometimes escapes us. So I think that we have from, they've sent me some questions from people that are participating in the, watching or actually on Facebook. And I think they tie well to the discussion now. So Sofia Vlahu is asking 2 questions addressed to all of us, all of you. To what extent do you believe that digital organizing can impact central political decisions if traditional embodied protests become obsolete? So protests. Can, so to say, digital mobilization be a sufficient invention on their own sake for a new horizontal type of democracy? And the second question is, do the new digital communication platforms like Zoom, Zingy, etc., provide a really safe and confidential exchange environment? And do they also contain components that exercise censorship and may register the citizens' opinions and plans with the aim to control?
So I can answer a little bit to that first question from what we heard in the report, at least, which is not yet. At least there's pretty general consensus amongst the folks that we've talked with, both in the qualitative and the quantitative portions of our research, that especially folks that are leading advocacy for progressive causes, that without having an offline component, we're not there yet, at least. Now, what that means, there was also a lot of kind of recognition that what is offline and what is online, especially in 2020, is not really as clear. that a lot of, like, if we're talking about actual activation and mobilization, many people identified that the actual kind of like change from a cause to a movement, or the change from a supporter to an activist, that this moment of firming up commitment and having something that's more meaningful, that really happens pretty much, or traditionally has happened, in an offline way. That it's very hard to actually get that to happen in an online way. But we know it's 2020, here we are in Zoom. We know that, like a lot of the traditional stuff, canvassing in the US, I mean, I did a little bit of work in the US this election cycle, not too much, but a lot of my friends were deeply involved with trying to crack the nut on what do we do for deep canvassing, or what do we do for our traditional GOTV activities that would get people out to there. And we are, I think, being forced to push the edge a little bit with those discovering more meaningful ways to connect and to bring that kind of, whether that's street activism or parliamentary debates or
I think, yeah, it's right. Okay, until we get Ned back, maybe we can deal with another question that somebody has sent us.
Developing, we don't have
Oh,
solved.
please. Okay, continue, please.
No, that was it. Basically, I just don't think we have it solved yet. It's on its way, but it's not there yet.
All right, true. Okay, so we have a participant sent us a statement or something said by the Estonia's former president, Toomas Ilves. Estonia being the country that actually is quite advanced in internet democracy. And it is on privacy protections and positive corrections to systemic inequities. Privacy protections and positive corrections to systemic inequities must be built in to ensure democratic values are protected and strengthened. Digital governance only works, however, if trust has been established within the government and the citizen. Building this trust and reaping the benefits of digital governance require two critical policy interventions: secure digital identities for citizens and resilient data architectures for governments. If you could comment on that.
Well, I interviewed Toomas for my book, so perhaps I'll jump in first. What a fascinating world leader he is, by the way. And if anyone here wants to learn more about how world leaders are being changed by the digital age, I think you can go look no further than Toomas and what he did in Estonia at the end of the Cold War as it gained independence. I want to jump in on I think it will answer those two bullet points. One of the things I was most fascinated to talk to him about, and that I understood he was beginning to think about, was almost like whether everything that we're seeing happening is actually changing the idea of what a state even is. So, you know, which is obviously the kind of fundamental unit of political organization, really. And when we're talking about power and politics, we really mean normally some kind of control of the state apparatus ultimately. Cities, of course, and multilateral institutions as well, but states remain sovereign, really. Now, states since the Treaty of Westphalia have always been geopolitical pockets around the world. And suddenly, when you look at Estonia, that notion, I think, begins to be challenged. They've built something called the X Road, which is a kind of a statutory architecture to allow the delivery of state services, which can basically continue to function even if Estonia was fully invaded. And some say has been deliberately built in part for that purpose. They've pioneered in Estonia the idea of server embassies, basically secure closets where the services can continue to be hosted outside of Estonia, but on sovereign Estonian soil. So there's one in Luxembourg, and they created the idea of e-residency, which I know they were advertising extensively in the UK immediately after the Brexit decision, which would basically allow business owners to apply for e-residency in Estonia in order to continue to access EU markets and services whilst being physically outside of the EU. Now, all of this kind of implies that services that states aren't necessarily tied to geography anymore. That they're beginning to dissolve slightly into the digital ether. And I remember that one thing that President Ive said to me was, states supply services, and now you don't have to supply services in any kind of geographic way. So maybe that means that states will change as well. I just thought that was a kind of fascinating idea to end it on. I'm not sure we really know what are going to happen to states yet. And for sure, states are institutions which tend to never allow power to slip away. And they are extremely versatile and agile institutions when they need to be in order to maintain power. But I do like the idea that maybe in the future we are talking about politics, which partly still has to do with, you know, states and elections and decision making there, but partly might also actually involve completely abstract entities of people, constituencies of people which are formed online, which make decision making in other ways which are meaningful to all of us, and have their own democratic apparatuses which are meaningful to us as well. And perhaps that is an even more radical vision than simply the one where digital democracy is changing the way that states behave. Maybe the ultimate radical decision here is that the actual basic currency of politics itself will begin to be reshuffled a bit in the years ahead.
True. I mean, states control two things, territories and population. And if space dissolves, and this is an interesting thing, what the digital does to space, it came up to our discussion yesterday as well with the other presenters. Again, from a geographer who was thinking of how to undertake research. The field is no longer out there, the field as we know it. The field has become forbidden because of COVID. The digital has killed the field, the outside field as we know it. Lenyo is an anthropologist. So what do we research? How do we validate our research? How do we do? How do we go on? But having said that, Carl, it seems to me that what you have described about Estonia becoming supra-territorial preserves one thing, nation-state Estonia. So in a way, it moves back from the state as we know it now with jus soli, to the primordial state, nation state, to a former, even previous state of form of state or belonging, which is the nation. Why should we preserve Estonia then?
But also,
imaginary thing.
I want to jump in just for a second, Carl, before you maybe answer this, that in a way, space is coming back to us with a vengeance because of the inequities that have to do with inhabiting this planet, which are becoming kind of larger and larger. So, you know, when we're having climate refugees kind of moving through space and the idea of the nation state is reaffirmed as a very kind of important unit. So who actually has the control over the territories that are not torched and scorched and burned by fires or gone underwater, etc., is extreme. Is again, the importance of it is rising. So as the digital kind of reality is becoming stronger, the physical reality is also kind of biting us in our butts, if I can say that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Look, discussing whether nation states are going to wither away is a kind of a question that think tankers like me enjoyed talking about kind of 3 or 4 years ago. I think kind of since then, another thing has happened, which is that states have actually began to claw a lot more power back and actually assert the kind of necessary geography of the internet, if you will, you know, like data sovereignty, where are the servers, where's the data hosted, even actually asserting kind of statutory control over some of the more fundamental protocols which actually govern the flow of information around the internet. There's a big conflict happening at the moment about the Internet of Things and the kind of protocol layer that gets dumped on top and whether states will control that or not. In a way, information warfare itself, you know, and all the things we're seeing around influence operations and disinformation and fake news, you know, geopolitics being exerted online is itself part of the story, I think, of states kind of reasserting sovereignty in a space that they probably ignored for too long to be comfortable to them. But I still think that the Estonia and Despina, you know, no, I'm not necessarily saying that Estonia should win out here. I think the point is that it will be everyone's choice about whether they sign up for e-residency in Estonia or sign up for residency somewhere else. And the kind of future I see, much like a lot of the stories that I think are true about power, is quite a conflicted one. There's no clear line of sight. So I can both see that states are trying to exert sovereignty online, but I could also see that it's possible that something like e-residency and something like more ageographic service provision by states or things that look like states also emerge, so that you know, you might feel like you're a member of a nation, but actually we already feel like we're members, like subculturally, the internet's already allowed loads of identities to form, which, you know, don't know any boundaries whatsoever. You know, and that will only accelerate too. So perhaps we're going to be kind of stretched in both those directions at the same time, with some power remaining in sovereign actors and states, but actually quite a lot of it ascending upwards into a perfect ether. And that was actually the dream of the early kind of cyber pioneers anyway. So I quite like the circularity of that, if that does come true.
The problem is that the challenges are beyond the states, that have risen on a level that is really beyond the states, and that if we move to a kind of democratic representation, if we want this supra level to be that is above and beyond the states, that can deal with big issues like pandemics, like climate change, like this and that, how do we build the kind of trust that needs to be built through these things that you guys are suggesting, when you lose the kind of the level that's kind of more the level of the polis, let's say, of the city, let's say, or of something like that. Like the nation took a long time to build the idea of belonging and trust and all that kind of stuff, kind of to superimpose it on its geopolitical stuff. But what the whole thing is like, who will have the power to decide about who builds the platforms that we participate in that are supranatural? Who creates the common reality that we all can trust in, that can deal with climate kind of issues? I mean, these are really issues that I want to hear a little bit more from you about.
Yeah, and I'd say the other thing too is what's particularly interesting is as the kind of relevance or potential relevance of nation states decline, there's an actual anxiety reaction that's coming out from that, a nationalist, anti-immigrant anxiety reaction that's coming out in general in population in response to it. So it's funny that while we have, and I don't think it's just digital possibilities that are kind of decreasing the value of nation states. I think we live in a globalized world that, generally speaking, represents pretty much only businesses at a global level and not much else that we need to be addressing in terms of just, and we don't have the opportunities for the decision making. So there's this general kind of like reactionary, this is not my area, but I see it within the work the things that we're fighting, these kind of anti-immigration things, the populist, things that our clients are working with or against, the reality is we see this kind of overall general reaction to cling to nation state identity because of the fear of losing whatever privileges those might come with. And so we're having this additional challenge of where we have probably the greatest challenges that we've ever faced, that we must face as a humankind. And with 2020, there's no greater moment to remind us as 2020 that there's no such thing as a nation state specific issue really in so many ways, it's global. So it's going to cross borders, a pandemic is going to cross borders, whether you like it or not. Trade is going to cause, human rights abuses or, workers, loss in workers' rights, whether you like it or not, the environment is being destroyed, whether you like it or not. And these are going to be issues which are always going to be global issues at this point. And people are clinging and electing, people that are trying to hold on to that nostalgia of relevance that we could solve these problems at a nation state level, or that we could protect at least individuals that are at a nation state level, when the actual protection of those individuals has to happen by creating more political ways of solving these issues. I mean, I'm an American, probably recognized by my accent, but like I'm so deeply protective and value the kind of European Union as a project because we need more transnational projects and it's not perfect. And it's, like we heard in our report so clearly that Europe in so many ways has these very rigid institutional structures that make it very hard to pierce through and make people feel like they're part of it, which has protected it from populism for, since World War II and in many ways, but is also at this point of people being frustrated because of the rigidity with it. So there's also this fragility that exists in it. But I'm so invested in, despite its challenges and despite its rigidity, I'm so invested in seeing this project as a way forward for our world, because those kind of national governance that we're going to need to see more of, whether it's done digitally or just through traditional structures, are really the only way I think our species is going to survive. If you ask me, but that's just my own personal, and why I do hope that we do find more of these ways through digital means, which is, not just about election day, which is not just about a European Parliament, or which is really about making a way that we can, be connected in a way that we weren't across borders, across geographies. I was in this talk last week with the university. One of the students asked me this question. He said, "Isn't it just polarizing people more if you're just, looking at these things? Aren't we all just, according to our nation, that, and then everything else is differences?" And I kind of pointed out that, like, well, no, not necessarily. Like I'm a gay man, and I would more likely have more in common probably with an LGBT person from, a European country than I would necessarily with a random person from the US where I grew up. So, and that's just one example, but there's many identities and ways in which we connect across borders that are just the reality of our kind of global understanding. And we need to grow up to that in our decision-making processes. And hopefully digital will be one of those ways we can meet the challenge.
So definitely, and I think that is a very it's very insightful to say that we do have many other identities that develop in real time and in real life and digitally as well. And all of this come into the play of politics of power. I mean, it's all part of it. So I would like to ask you if you have any kind of final comments or any final sort of remarks or questions to ask each other. Adria, so that we sort of bring this very, very fruitful discussion to a close. I really want to thank you very, very much for being here and for being here for us. And I truly hope that we will have more time and more ways to continue working together in many different ways. So, any more points from any of you? So, thank you so much again. And see you all hopefully face to face soon. And rest well. And
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
very interesting to meet
Thank you
you
for the panel.
guys.
Yes, equally.